Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into the sometimes frustrating, sometimes funny, always fascinating world of human error?
Where our brains take those unexpected detours, those blunders and slip-ups.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, our compass is James Reason's book, Human Error.
A really insightful look into why we make the mistakes we do.
It really is. We'll be exploring how something as basic as word frequency can influence our perceptions,
And how delays in feedback can really mess with our decision-making.
and why even in complex systems, good people can still make bad choices.
It's captivating, isn't it? The whole mechanics of how our minds can lead us astray.
It is. It's not just about labeling actions as right or wrong.
It's more about understanding those patterns in our mistakes.
Right, and seeing how they emerge from, like, the inner workings of our minds.
Reason argues that to truly get these mistakes, we need to understand these different levels that our minds operate on.
Okay, I like where this is going.
He breaks down human performance into 3 levels, starting with skill-based,
Skill-based, okay.
then rule-based, and finally knowledge-based.
3 levels. Can you break those down a bit more?
Absolutely. So picture a hierarchy of control in our minds.
Oh, I like visuals.
At the base, we have those skill-based actions, so ingrained they become automatic.
Like driving a familiar route. You're on autopilot.
Precisely. Thoughts might be wandering, but your hands are on the wheel, shifting gears, signaling, all without conscious effort.
Like a separate program running in the background. I can definitely relate to that.
Right. Now, moving up that hierarchy, we get to rule-based performance.
Okay, rule-based, so this is where learned procedures come in.
Exactly. Think of carefully following a recipe.
Not like inventing some new culinary masterpiece.
More like using those established rules to guide your actions.
But this is also where things can get tricky. Like, what happens when we misinterpret a rule?
Or apply a perfectly good rule, but in the wrong context.
Cue the culinary catastrophe.
Or, in less delicious terms, a classic rule-based error.
Makes sense? And then, at the top of this mental pyramid,
We have knowledge-based performance. This kicks in when we face new situations that need on-the-spot problem solving.
okay, so imagine troubleshooting a computer glitch.
Exactly. You're drawing on your understanding of how the system works, testing theories.
Making judgments with incomplete information.
That's where our conscious workspace really gets a workout.
But wouldn't that also make us more prone to errors at that level?
You're right. Our mental models might be flawed, attention spans are limited,
And even our best judgments can be clouded by biases.
which begs the question, if these errors are so baked into how our minds work, are they really mistakes?
Or just part of being human. I like how you frame that.
It leads us to this fascinating concept, cognitive underspecification.
Things are getting juicy now. Cognitive underspecification.
It means that our knowledge of the world is often incomplete or imprecise.
So our brains, they love a shortcut, don't they?
They do. They favor those frequent, familiar responses.
Even when those responses might be wrong in a specific situation. It's almost like frequency trumps accuracy for our brains.
A great example is the oak yolk experiment. Participants were primed with rhyming words like folk, joke, and poke.
Okay, I'm following.
Then asked a simple question, what's the yellow part of an egg called?
Seems pretty straightforward.
But a surprising number, influenced by those rhymes, answered yolk incorrectly.
Wow, so even though they knew the right answer,
Those rhyming words kind of messed with their response.
like their brain said, hey, yolk rings a bell, let's go with that.
Exactly. And this isn't just some quirky experiment.
No, I'm sure it shows up everywhere.
Research on word recognition, for example, shows we identify common words much faster than uncommon ones.
Especially in tough situations, like if the word flashes quickly.
Or there's background noise.
Right, our brains prioritize the familiar, what we've seen the most.
We see this even in something like category generation.
Okay, what do you mean?
If asked, name a four-legged animal, we're much quicker to say dog than say aardvark.
Even though both fit the description.
Right. It's not about deep analysis.
More about that frequency bias.
It all comes down to 2 automatic processes that govern how we retrieve knowledge.
2 processes. Lay them on me.
Similarity matching and frequency gambling.
Interesting.
In similarity matching, our brain tries to find the best match to given cues, like fitting puzzle pieces together.
Makes sense.
But when those cues are unclear or our knowledge is shaky, frequency gambling takes over.
We go with what we've encountered most often.
Think back to that quiz about American presidents.
Oh, yeah, I remember that from the book.
A lot of people, especially those who didn't know much about presidents,
They based their guesses on frequency.
attributing quotes to those super famous presidents.
Even if the content didn't really match.
Their brains went for those celebrity presidents, the most recognizable options.
So this frequency bias can really lead us down the wrong path. But what about recognizing our own errors? Is that easier in some situations than others?
That adds a whole other layer of complexity. Error detection actually varies across those performance levels we talked about.
So at that skill-based level, it seems pretty straightforward.
Like, if you're about to trip while walking, you feel that loss of balance and adjust.
Right. But at the rule-based level, it gets trickier.
Because a misapplied rule might not give you immediate feedback
You could follow a bad recipe for a while.
before realizing your cake is a total brick.
Exactly. And at that highest level, knowledge-based, that's where error detection gets really tough.
Those wrong assumptions buried in our mental models, we might not even notice them.
Research backs that up, right?
Studies on keyboard tasks and visual search show that people can catch those execution errors, slips of the fingers.
But struggle with identifying those deeper mistakes, the ones based on bad logic or misinterpretations. So we're good at spotting typos, but not so good at recognizing flawed arguments. Are there any exceptions to this?
Speech errors are an interesting one.
Oh, yeah.
We seem to correct slips of the tongue pretty easily.
That's true, we do. Why is that?
It highlights a drive for successful communication, I think, and linguistic accuracy.
We're constantly monitoring our speech, making sure it matches both what we mean and the rules of grammar.
It suggests we're good at detecting errors when the feedback is instant and clear, less so when it involves more abstract ideas or delayed consequences.
So what happens when those undetected errors pile up, especially in big, complex systems?
That brings us to the concept of latent errors.
Latent errors, those hidden flaws.
In system designs, procedures, training, they can lie dormant until triggered by some other event,
So like time bombs ticking away.
often unnoticed until they contribute to a huge failure.
Latent errors, those are scary. Like they're just waiting for the right, or I guess the wrong set of circumstances to cause a disaster. So they're different from active errors, those operator mistakes that happen right on the front lines, with immediate and localized consequences. But latent errors, they can have huge, far-reaching consequences. To really understand their impacts, I think we need to look at some case studies.
And Reason really breaks down some infamous disasters in the book. Cases like 3 Mile Island, Bhopal, Challenger, Chernobyl, the Zebro Ferry disaster, and the King's Cross underground fire, all highlighting the insidious nature of latent errors within complex systems.
Each incident, though, has its own nuances. Are there common threads or patterns in how these latent errors interacted with active errors to create such disastrous outcomes?
One thing that really stands out is how these calamities often resulted from a confluence of factors: design flaws, management failures, insufficient training, communication breakdowns. It wasn't just one single point of failure.
More like a chain reaction.
Exactly, a cascade of events, each seemingly minor on its own, but together leading to this perfect storm of disaster.
That makes me think about the challenges of accident investigation. How do you sift through all the debris, both literal and figurative, to figure out what truly went wrong?
It's incredibly complex. And we have to be so careful about hindsight bias, how knowing the outcome can warp our view of past events.
Making them seem more predictable and blameworthy than they were in the moment.
Exactly. It's not as simple as saying, oh, this person messed up, end of story.
We need to consider the context, the pressures people were under,
Yeah.
and those systemic vulnerabilities that contributed to the events.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the choices people made based on the information they had at the time, recognizing that they didn't have the benefit of knowing how things would ultimately play out.
It really highlights how we're all susceptible to this bias, not just accident investigators.
Right.
We create stories to make sense of the world. But those stories can be skewed by our knowledge of the ending.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? Even our best attempts to reconstruct the past can be influenced by things outside our conscious awareness.
This deep dive is definitely giving me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, I'd love to crystallize some of the key takeaways from Reason's book. Can you give us a concise rundown of those main points?
Of course. Let's boil it down to a 10-point summary that captures the essence of our discussion.
That would be great. It'll provide our listeners with a solid framework for navigating this intricate world of human error.
First, human error is an inevitable part of life, a consequence of our cognitive limits and the complexity of the systems we interact with.
It's a reminder that we're not perfect. Our minds, as amazing as they are still vulnerable to slip-ups.
Second, errors happen at different levels of performance. From those skill-based slips to those knowledge-based mistakes, each with its own cognitive origins.
The whole spectrum of fallibility.
Yeah.
From autopilot mishaps to those head-scratching blunders where you think, what was I thinking?
Third, cognitive underspecification pushes us to rely on frequency and familiarity, leading us to errors, even with good intentions. Our brains are drawn to those familiar paths, even when they might be the wrong ones.
Like in that Okyuk experiment, right? Our intuition can be swayed simply by hearing familiar sounds repeated.
Exactly. Fourth, similarity matching and frequency gambling are automatic processes that shape how we recall information. They can really influence our choices, especially in uncertain situations.
It's like our brains are always playing the odds, betting on those past experiences.
Fifth, error detection is super important, but it can be hampered by things like limited attention, task complexity, and the type of feedback we get.
So even when alarm bells should be going off in our heads, we might miss them amidst distractions, complicated procedures, or delayed consequences.
Sixth, those latent errors, hidden flaws within systems, can combine with active errors to cause major accidents.
There's the silent partners in disaster, waiting for the right conditions to strike.
Seventh, accidents often arise from a complex mix of individual actions and organizational factors, making it essential to consider both human and systemic vulnerabilities.
It's about understanding all the pieces of the puzzle,
Right. It's not about blaming individuals, but understanding how different factors contribute.
like a chain reaction, where each domino plays a role in the final collapse.
Eighth, hindsight bias can really cloud our judgment when looking back at past events, making us overestimate predictability and misplace blame.
It's so important to be empathetic when analyzing accidents, to step back from our position of knowing the outcome and try to see things from the perspective of those involved.
Absolutely. Ninth, building systems that can tolerate errors means acknowledging our human limitations.
And putting in place safeguards, feedback mechanisms, and training that helps build resilience.
It's not about striving for this unattainable ideal of perfection. It's about accepting that people make mistakes and designing systems that minimize the risks associated with those mistakes.
And lastly, that 10th takeaway, maybe the most important one, understanding how our minds work when we make errors is essential for improving safety, performance, and decision-making in all areas of life.
This deep dive has really reinforced that idea.
Absolutely. It's not just about avoiding mistakes, but about gleaning insights from them and using that knowledge to create a safer and more resilient world.
We've covered a lot of ground in this exploration of human error.
But it feels like we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore about this fundamental part of our existence.
Oh, definitely. The bottomless well of inquiry.
It really is.
Okay.
But I think we've given our listeners some great tools to recognize, analyze, maybe even mitigate those inevitable oops moments.
I think you're right.
To help cement those tools, let's go back to those 10 key insights from Reason's book. Would you mind running through those one more time?
Absolutely. Let's recap those takeaways. Starting with the very first human error is just an unavoidable reality, a consequence of our limited cognitive abilities and the inherent complexities of the systems we operate in.
It's kind of humbling to acknowledge that we're not perfect. Our minds, as amazing as they are, still have those glitches and shortcuts.
Right. Our second point, remember that errors occur at different levels of performance. From those skill-based slips to those knowledge-based mistakes, each coming from different cognitive processes.
We're constantly moving along this spectrum of fallibility, from those autopilot mishaps to those embarrassing blunders where you're left thinking, what was I doing?
Exactly. Third, cognitive underspecification often pushes us to lean on frequency and familiarity, which can lead to errors even when we have the best intentions. Our brains are drawn to those well-trodden paths even when they might lead us astray.
The oak yolk experiment really drives that point home. It shows how our intuition can be influenced simply by hearing familiar sounds repeated over and over again.
For sure. Fourth, remember that similarity matching and frequency gambling, these are automatic processes that influence how we access information. They can subtly shape our decisions, especially when we're facing uncertainty. They're like our brain's default mode for sorting through all that information stored in our minds.
It often feels like our brains are playing a game of chance, relying on past experiences and hoping for the best.
Fifth, even though it's crucial, error detection can be hindered by things like our limited attention, the complexity of the task, and the kind of feedback we receive.
So even when alarm bells should be ringing in our heads, we might miss them because of distractions, complicated procedures, or delayed consequences.
Absolutely. Sixth, those latent errors, Those hidden flaws lurking within systems can team up with active errors to cause major accidents.
Acting like silent partners in disaster, just waiting for the right conditions to wreak havoc.
Right. Seventh, remember that accidents often stem from a complicated mix of individual actions and organizational factors. So it's crucial to look at both human and systemic vulnerabilities. It's not about assigning blame, but about understanding all the factors that contribute to a problem.
It's like those domino chains, where each domino plays a role in the final collapse.
Exactly. Eighth, hindsight bias can really distort our understanding of past events, leading us to overestimate predictability and misplace blame.
This emphasizes how important it is to be empathetic when analyzing accidents, to put ourselves in the shoes of those involved and see things from their perspective without the knowledge of the outcome.
I agree. Ninth, if we want to design systems that can tolerate errors, we need to acknowledge our human limitations and put in place safeguards, feedback loops, and training programs that promote resilience.
So it's not about striving for an impossible standard of perfection, but about accepting that people will make mistakes,
Yeah.
and then designing systems that minimize the risks associated with those mistakes.
Right. And finally, our 10th takeaway, perhaps the most important one, is that understanding how our minds work when we make errors is essential for improving safety, performance, and decision-making in every aspect of our lives.
This deep dive has really highlighted that point.
Absolutely. It's not just about avoiding mistakes, it's about learning from them, extracting valuable lessons, and using that knowledge to create a safer, more resilient world.
I couldn't agree more. This has been a truly enlightening exploration of human error. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep those minds curious, and remember, even in those oops moments, there's always something to be learned.